This video lesson is part of my video course that teaches how to build transactional, event-driven microservices with Spring Boot and Axon Framework. For other video lessons in this playlist, please check the description of this video below. How long do we wait for a saga to complete? For some business operations, it is okay to wait for a day or two to complete. And what if we waited for a day or two, but a certain required event in Saga still did not take place? How do we know that an event did not take place, and what do we do then? In the following video lessons, we will talk about deadlines, how to schedule a deadline, and how to handle a deadline. And before we look at the code example, I would like to tell you a little bit about the deadlines first. First of all, a deadline is an event that takes place if another expected event did not take place. For example, you will send a command, and within the next 24 hours, you will expect an event to take place. And if the event you're expecting did not take place within the scheduled, let's say 24 hours deadline, then you will want another event to take place. You might also think of it as a timeout. If after a certain scheduled time an event did not take place, then you want another event to take place automatically. So deadlines are very helpful in those use cases when you have a Saga flow that involves multiple steps and it might take multiple hours for the Saga flow to complete. And if after waiting for the needed amount of hours an important event still did not take place, then you expect a timeout or a deadline to trigger and you want to send a compensating command. Deadlines can be scheduled in Saga as well as outside of Saga. And the most common place that you will schedule a deadline is in Saga, although you can also schedule a deadline in the aggregate class as well. When a deadline takes place, a deadline event is triggered, and you might want to use this event to change the state of a certain property in Saga, for example, or you might want to use this event to send a new command or send a compensating command to roll back previously done changes. If you schedule a deadline in the aggregate class and the deadline did take place, this deadline event will not be event sourced and it will not be persisted in the event store. And deadline events, they are triggered only one time. For it to be triggered again, you will need to schedule a new deadline. Let's have a look at a little source code example. To schedule a deadline, you will first need to create a deadline manager and make it available as a bean. The deadline manager comes in two flavors. The first one is a simple deadline manager, and in the code snippet on my screen, I'm creating a new instance of a simple deadline manager. The second flavor is more advanced, and it creates an instance of a more advanced Quartz deadline manager. The main difference between the two is that the simple deadline manager keeps scheduled tasks in memory and it does not persist them. So if JVM shuts down, then the scheduled deadlines are lost. The Quartz deadline manager is more advanced and it will use a persistent storage to keep the scheduled tasks. This way, if JVM restarts, then the scheduled deadlines are not lost. So you might want to use the Quartz deadline manager for a longer time deadlines. For example, if you want to schedule a deadline to wait for 7 days, then you will most likely want to use Quartz deadline manager instead of a simple deadline manager. Also, the Quartz deadline manager, it will delegate the scheduling and triggering to a Quartz scheduler, and the Quartz scheduler, it is outside of Axon Framework, and to use it you will need to add additional Quartz dependencies to POM.xml file of your project. So if you want to use it, and if you want to configure Quartz deadline manager to be used with a specific persistent storage, then I suggest you to Google for it and look into Quartz scheduler for more details. At the time of recording these video lessons, I was not planning to go in details into Quartz scheduler. To schedule a deadline, you will need to inject a deadline manager into a class, for example, into a Saga class. You can then schedule a deadline for a number of seconds, minutes, hours, or even days. Assign to your deadline a unique name and give it an optional payload. To handle a deadline, you'll need to create a method that is annotated with deadline handler annotation and use the deadline name under which it was initially scheduled. It is up to you what you want to do when a deadline event takes place, but some possible actions could be to send a compensating command, for example, and then also change the state of a property in a Saga instance. Alright, so let's go back to our application, let's schedule a simple deadline and let's see how it works.